My name is Rory Mahoney, and I'm a pipefitter from Detroit. 48 hours ago, I was drinking beer and watching Monday Night Football. Then the zombie outbreak started, and everything I knew about my city became a matter of life and death. My knowledge of pipes, tunnels, and water systems was the only thing standing between my group and becoming zombie food. I had to make impossible choices, abandon people to save others, and use every trick I learned in 15 years of union work just to survive 2 days of hell. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Rory Mahoney, and I'm a pipefitter from Detroit. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 weeks ago, but it feels like a lifetime. I'm sharing this story because knowledge saves lives, and maybe something I learned during those first 48 hours can help you if this nightmare ever reaches your doorstep. Every detail matters when the dead start walking, even the ones that seem insignificant at first. It was Monday night, October 15th, around 6:30 in the evening. I was sprawled on my beaten-up couch in my apartment on Michigan Avenue in Corktown, nursing a cold Budweiser and watching the Lions play the Packers. After 15 years of crawling through basements and fitting pipes, Monday Night Football was my religion. My toolbox sat in the hallway closet where it always did, ready for whatever emergency call might come in from local 597. We pipefitters learn early that you keep your tools ready because you never know when the city's going to need you to fix something that broke at the worst possible moment. The first interruption came during halftime. That annoying emergency broadcast tone started blaring from my TV, and the screen went blue with white text scrolling across it. I figured it was another test of the emergency system, or maybe some weather warning I did not care about. The automated voice droned on about staying indoors and avoiding contact with individuals displaying signs of extreme aggression. I rolled my eyes and grabbed the remote to change channels, thinking it was probably some domestic violence situation getting blown out of proportion. But every channel had the same message. Channel 7, Channel 4, even the cable news networks. That should have been my first real warning, but I was more annoyed than concerned. The government was always finding new ways to interrupt regular programming with their warnings and advisories. I muted the TV and walked to my kitchen to grab another beer from the fridge. That's when I looked out my fourth-floor window that faces Michigan Avenue and saw Mrs. Chen from apartment 2 billion stumbling down the sidewalk in her nightgown. Mrs. Chen was a retired teacher, maybe 70 years old, and she always dressed properly when she left her apartment. Seeing her outside in sleepwear at this hour struck me as odd, but what really caught my attention was how she was moving. Her steps were jerky and uncoordinated, like she was drunk or having some kind of medical episode. Behind her, maybe 50 yards back, came Mr. Rodriguez from the building next door. He was walking with that same strange, shuffling gait that did not look natural. Even from 4 stories up, I could see dark stains covering both of their clothes. My first thought was that there had been some kind of accident, maybe a gas leak or chemical spill that was making people disoriented. I stood there watching for maybe 5 minutes, and more people started appearing on the street. A woman in a torn business suit dragging one leg behind her. A teenager with what looked like chunks missing from his left arm, though the distance made it hard to be sure. They were all moving in the same direction, all with that same unnatural shuffle, all seeming to follow some invisible trail toward the apartment complex across the street. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jake Morrison, my foreman at the job site where we had been working on the new water treatment upgrades downtown. The message read, "Stay inside. Something's happening at the plant. Tommy's been bit by some crazy guy. They're saying to evacuate, but cops won't let anyone leave. Don't come in tomorrow." Tommy Kowalski was one of our best guys, a 20-year veteran of the local who could thread pipe faster than anyone I knew. If someone had attacked Tommy at the job site, it meant whatever was happening was not limited to my neighborhood. I tried calling Jake back, but the call went straight to voicemail. The cell towers were probably overloaded with everyone trying to reach their families. I walked back to the living room and unmuted the TV. The emergency broadcast was still running, but now it included more specific information. The Centers for Disease Control was reporting incidents of extreme violence in major metropolitan areas across the country. Detroit, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. The message urged citizens to remain in their homes and avoid contact with anyone exhibiting aggressive behavior or appearing injured. The phrase that stuck with me was appearing injured. I thought about Mrs. Chen's dark-stained clothes and the teenager with the damaged arm. These were not people having medical emergencies. Something else was happening, something the government was not being entirely honest about in their carefully worded broadcasts. I tried calling my sister Colleen in Chicago. She taught fourth grade at an elementary school on the South Side, and if this situation was happening in multiple cities, she might be in danger. The call would not go through. I tried 3 more times with the same result. The phone lines were either jammed or down completely. That's when I heard the first scream from somewhere below me in the building. It was not a scream of surprise or even pain. It was the kind of scream that comes from pure terror, the sound someone makes when they realize they are about to die. The scream came from the direction of the lobby, maybe 1 or 2 floors down. I had lived in this building for 8 years and I knew the sounds it made. This was not normal. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, then stopped with my hand on the deadbolt. Jake's message had said to stay inside. The emergency broadcast had said the same thing. But someone in my building was in serious trouble, and I could not just ignore that. I had spent 4 years in the Navy before I got into the trades, and walking away from someone who needed help went against everything I believed in. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The building was older, built in the 1920s, with thick walls and solid construction. But I could hear more sounds now that I was outside my apartment. Sounds of struggle, of furniture being knocked over, and worst of all, sounds that reminded me of animals feeding. The hallway was dimly lit by overhead fixtures that had not been updated since the Carter administration. I could smell something wrong in the air, a metallic scent mixed with something else I could not identify. As I made my way toward the stairwell, I noticed that Mrs. Patterson's door from apartment 1A was standing wide open. Mrs. Patterson was a widow in her 80s who never left her door unlocked, let alone open. I called out her name as I approached the doorway, but there was no response. The smell was stronger here, and I could hear wet, tearing sounds coming from inside her apartment. Every instinct told me to turn around and go back to my own place, but I had to make sure she was okay. What I saw when I looked into her living room changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Mrs. Patterson was on the floor near her coffee table, and there was blood everywhere. But she was not alone. Crouched over her was Mr. Kim from apartment 3C, an elderly Korean War veteran who had always been friendly and polite in our brief encounters. Except Mr. Kim was not being friendly now. He was hunched over Mrs. Patterson, and he was eating her. There is no other way to describe what I saw. Mr. Kim had torn open Mrs. Patterson's throat and was consuming the flesh with the enthusiasm of a starving animal. The sounds I had heard were the sounds of him feeding. Mrs. Patterson was clearly dead, but Mr. Kim seemed completely unaware of my presence, even though I was standing less than 10 feet away. I called his name, thinking maybe he was having some kind of psychotic break and could be reasoned with. Mr. Kim's head snapped up at the sound of my voice, and that's when I got my first real look at what he had become. His eyes were completely white, no pupils or iris visible. His mouth and chin were covered in blood, and when he opened his mouth, I could see that his teeth had torn through Mrs. Patterson's flesh like he was some kind of predator. But the worst part was his skin. It had a grayish pallor that made him look like he had been dead for hours. There were dark veins visible under the surface, and his movements were stiff and unnatural. This was not Mr. Kim having a medical emergency or a psychotic episode. This was something else entirely. He stood up slowly, never taking those white eyes off me, and started moving in my direction. His gait was that same shuffle I had observed from my window, and he was making a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a moan. I backed out of the doorway and into the hallway, hoping that removing myself from his sight might calm him down. It did not work. Mr. Kim followed me into the hallway, moving with that relentless shuffle, reaching out with hands that were stained with Mrs. Patterson's blood. I tried talking to him, using his name, trying to get through to whatever part of him might still be human. Nothing worked. He kept coming, and the sound he was making was getting louder. I am not a violent person by nature, but 15 years of construction work and 4 years in the Navy taught me how to handle myself when necessary. When Mr. Kim got close enough to grab my shirt, I pushed him as hard as I could. He fell backward and hit his head against the corner of the hallway wall with a sound like a melon dropping on concrete. Mr. Kim went down and stayed down. There was blood pooling under his head, and he was not moving or breathing. I had killed him, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. I had never killed anyone before, not even during my military service. But I told myself it was self-defense, that something was seriously wrong with him, and that he would have hurt me if I had not acted. I knelt down and checked for a pulse, thinking maybe I could help him somehow. His skin was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been even if he had just died. There was no pulse, no breathing, nothing. Mr. Kim was definitely dead. That's when he opened his eyes and grabbed my wrist. I jerked backward so hard that I fell on my backside and scrambled away from him like a crab. Mr. Kim was getting back to his feet, the head wound still bleeding, but apparently not slowing him down at all. The sound he was making had changed to something more urgent, more hungry. He was looking at me the same way he had been looking at Mrs. Patterson. I ran back to my apartment, slammed the door, and threw every lock I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the chain in place. I could hear Mr. Kim in the hallway, and now there were other sounds too. More of those moaning growls coming from different directions. Whatever had happened to Mr. Kim was happening to other people in the building. I grabbed my phone and tried calling 911, but I could not get through. The automated message said all circuits were busy and to try again later. I tried the non-emergency police line with the same result. I tried the fire department. Nothing. Every emergency service in the city was either overwhelmed or down completely. That's when I started thinking like the pipefitter I was instead of panicking like a civilian. I needed information. I needed to understand what was happening, and I needed to figure out how to survive whatever this was. The emergency broadcasts had mentioned multiple cities, which meant this was not a localized incident. The fact that emergency services were not responding meant the situation was worse than they were telling us. I went back to my window and looked down at Michigan Avenue. There were more people in the street now, dozens of them, all moving with that same shuffle. Some were in pajamas, some in work clothes, some in outfits that suggested they had been interrupted in the middle of normal activities. What they all had in common was that grayish skin, those white eyes, and that relentless movement towards something that seemed to be drawing them. I could also see normal people, living people, trying to get away from the others. A man in a business suit was running down the sidewalk, constantly looking over his shoulder. A woman with 2 small children was trying to get them into a car while keeping an eye on the shuffling figures that were getting closer to her. It was clear that there were 2 types of people now, the living and something else. My phone rang and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The caller ID showed Jake Morrison's number. I answered it on the first ring. "Jake, what the hell is going on?" "Rory, listen to me carefully." Jake's voice was strained and quiet, like he was trying not to be overheard. "Don't leave your apartment. Don't let anyone in. The whole city's going crazy. People are attacking each other, biting each other. Tommy's dead, but he's still moving around. I saw him get shot 3 times by a cop and he kept walking like nothing happened. Jake, I think it's happening in my building too. My neighbor, he was eating another neighbor. I thought I killed him, but he got back up. They don't stay dead, Rory. Whatever this is, killing them the normal way doesn't work. The cops are saying you have to destroy the brain, but I don't know if that's true or just rumor. The National Guard's been called in, but they're not here yet. The radio's saying this is happening everywhere. I could hear other voices in the background of Jake's call, and they did not sound calm. Where are you right now? We're holed up in the office trailer at the job site. There's maybe 8 of us here, but we can see those things outside trying to get in. The chain link fence is keeping them out for now, but I don't think it'll hold if more show up. That job site was the water treatment plant expansion project we had been working on for the past 6 months. It was a secure facility with good fencing and multiple buildings. If Jake and the others could hold out there, it might be a safer place than my apartment building. Jake, I need to get out of here. My building's compromised, and it's only a matter of time before they get into my apartment. No way, Rory. It's too dangerous out there. We can see the streets from here, and there's hundreds of those things wandering around. You're safer where you are. I wanted to believe him, but I was already thinking about the layout of my building. It was 4 stories tall with apartments on each floor and a basement that housed the boiler room and utility connections. I had been down there plenty of times over the years, helping the superintendent with heating problems and water line repairs. The building systems connected to the city's main infrastructure through a series of tunnels and utility corridors that ran under most of downtown Detroit. Jake, what if I could get there without using the streets? The buildings connected to the utility tunnel system. I helped repair the main water line last winter, remember? Those tunnels run all the way downtown. There was a long pause before Jake responded. You're talking about crawling through tunnels full of steam pipes and electrical conduits in the dark while the city's falling apart. That's insane. More insane than staying here and waiting for those things to break down my door. I could hear the sounds getting louder in the hallway outside. More of those moaning growls, and now there was scratching and pounding on doors. They were testing every apartment looking for a way in. It was only a matter of time before they found one. Listen, Jake, I'm going to try to make it to you guys, but if I don't, you need to know something about the water treatment plant. The emergency backup systems have manual overrides in the basement level. If the main power fails, you can still operate the pumps and filtration systems by hand. The valve controls are color-coded, red for emergency shutoffs, yellow for pressure release. If you need to defend the place, the steam distribution system can be weaponized if you know what you're doing. Rory, you're scaring me with that kind of talk. I'm just giving you information you might need. Promise me if something happens to me, you'll look after my sister Colleen when this is over. She's all the family I have left. Before Jake could respond, I heard a loud crash from somewhere else in the building. It sounded like a door being broken down, followed by screaming that was quickly cut short. They were getting into the apartments. I have to go, Jake. If I make it out of here, I'll try to reach the treatment plant through the tunnels. If not, you know where to find my tools if you need them. I hung up the phone and went to my closet to get my work gear. My tool bag contained everything a union pipefitter carries. Pipe wrenches, threading dies, measuring tape, flashlight, multi-tool, and most importantly, the heavy-duty bolt cutters that could open any lock or gate in the city. The bag weighed about 40 pounds, but every tool in it had the potential to save my life. I also grabbed my hard hat and work gloves. In the tunnels, I would need protection from steam pipes and sharp metal edges. I put on my heaviest work boots and my insulated coveralls. If I was going underground, I needed to be prepared for anything. The pounding on doors was getting closer to my floor. I could hear wood splintering and more screaming. Whatever these things were, they were strong enough to break down doors and aggressive enough to keep trying until they succeeded. My apartment door was solid oak from the building's original construction, but it would not hold forever. I went back to the window and looked down at the street one more time. The shuffling figures had multiplied, and now they filled most of the visible roadway. But more importantly, I could see the manholes that led down to the utility tunnels. There was one directly across the street and another one about a block north. If I could get to either one of those access points, I could disappear underground before the things in the street noticed me. The building's basement had its own access to the tunnel system through the utility connections. The boiler room had a maintenance hatch that led directly into the main water line tunnel. I had used that hatch last winter when we were troubleshooting pressure problems. If I could get to the basement without running into any of those creatures, I could be in the tunnels and heading toward the treatment plant within minutes. But first I had to get past whatever was trying to break down doors on the floors below me. I could hear them getting closer, and the sounds of splintering wood were becoming more frequent. Soon they would be on my floor, testing my door like they had tested all the others. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and unplugged anything that might make noise. If they thought the apartment was empty, they might move on to other doors. It was not much of a plan, but it was all I had. As I sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of my building being invaded, I thought about Colleen in Chicago. She had always been the smart one in our family, the one who went to college and became a teacher while I learned a trade. But right now, all her education would not help her if this nightmare had reached Chicago too. My knowledge of pipes and tunnels and city infrastructure might be the only thing that could get me to her. The pounding reached my floor, and I could hear them trying the doors one by one. Mrs. Chen's apartment, Mr. Rodriguez's place. They were working their way down the hall systematically, and my door was going to be next. I gripped my pipe wrench tighter and got ready to fight for my life. The pounding stopped at my door for what felt like an eternity. I could hear them on the other side, making those wet growling sounds, scratching at the wood with their fingernails. The smell was getting stronger too, that metallic scent mixed with something rotting that made my stomach turn. I held my breath and pressed myself against the wall next to the door, gripping my pipe wrench so tight my knuckles went white. After maybe 10 minutes, the sounds moved on to the next apartment. They were testing every door systematically, but they seemed to lose interest if they could not detect any signs of life inside. My plan of staying quiet and dark was working, at least for now. But I knew it was only temporary. Eventually, they would find a way into the building's lower levels, and once they did, they would have access to the same utility systems I was planning to use for my escape. I waited another hour before I made my move. The sounds from the hallway had died down, but I could still hear them moving around on other floors. The building was not secure anymore, and staying in my apartment was just delaying the inevitable. I needed to get to the basement while I still could. I put on my work gear and shouldered my tool bag. The weight was familiar and comforting after 15 years of carrying it to job sites across Detroit. Every union pipefitter learns that your tools are your lifeline, and you never go anywhere without them. In normal circumstances, I would drive to work and leave the bag in my truck until I needed it. But these were not normal circumstances, and that 40 pounds of steel and iron might be the only thing standing between me and becoming zombie food. I opened my door as quietly as possible and stepped into the hallway. The overhead lights were flickering now, probably due to power grid problems across the city. I could see blood on the walls and carpet, and several apartment doors had been broken open. Mrs. Patterson's door was still standing wide, and I could smell death coming from inside her apartment. I tried not to think about what was left of her in there. The stairwell was my biggest concern. It was narrow and had limited visibility, which meant anything could be waiting around the corners. But it was also the fastest way to reach the basement. I considered trying the elevator, but the power situation made that too risky. If the electricity failed while I was between floors, I would be trapped in a metal box with no way out. I made it down to the third floor without incident, but I could hear movement coming from apartment 3C. That was Mr. Kim's place, which meant either he had somehow made it back to his own apartment after our encounter, or there was something else in there. Either way, I was not stopping to investigate. I had learned my lesson about trying to help people who were beyond help. The second floor was worse. One of the apartment doors had been completely torn off its hinges, and there were drag marks in the blood on the floor leading toward the stairwell. Someone had been pulled out of their home and taken somewhere else in the building. I tried not to imagine what had happened to them. As I approached the first floor, I could hear multiple voices coming from the lobby area. Not the moaning growls I had gotten used to, but actual human voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. There were other survivors in the building, and they were gathered near the main entrance. Part of me wanted to join them, to find safety in numbers and share the burden of figuring out what to do next. But the rational part of my brain, the part trained by years of troubleshooting complex problems under pressure, told me that groups attract attention and make more noise than individuals. I decided to bypass the lobby entirely and head straight for the basement access. The building had a service entrance that led directly to the lower level, and it was accessible through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" that most tenants ignored. As the guy who had helped fix the boiler multiple times, I definitely qualified as authorized personnel. The service entrance was located at the rear of the building, away from the main lobby where the survivors were gathered. I had to pass through a short hallway that connected to the building's laundry room, but it was a route that would keep me away from whatever was happening at the front entrance. The hallway was dark, lit only by a single emergency light that cast everything in an eerie red glow. The laundry room was empty except for the usual collection of washers and dryers that had not been updated since the Reagan administration. I could hear water dripping from somewhere, which probably meant one of the pipes had burst during the chaos. That was not surprising given the age of the building's plumbing, but it also meant the basement might be partially flooded. I made a mental note to be careful about electrical hazards once I got down there. The door to the basement was exactly where I remembered it, tucked away behind the last row of washing machines. It was a heavy steel door with an industrial lock that required a key I did not have. Fortunately, I had my bolt cutters, and building management had never bothered to upgrade to hardened locks. The chain holding the door shut snapped with one good squeeze of the cutters. The basement was darker than I expected, even with my flashlight. The emergency lighting system had failed, which meant I would be working entirely by the beam of my handheld light. The smell down there was different from upstairs, more like mold and dampness with undertones of heating oil and rust. It was the smell of a building's guts, the hidden infrastructure that kept everything running but never got attention until something went wrong. I made my way through the maze of heating pipes and electrical conduits toward the boiler room. The building was old enough that its systems had been retrofitted multiple times over the decades, which meant pipes and wires were routed in ways that would make a modern engineer cry. But I knew this basement better than most because I had spent hours down here over the years, fixing problems that the building's superintendent was not qualified to handle. The boiler room was in the far corner of the basement, separated from the main area by a chain-link fence that was supposed to keep tenants away from dangerous equipment. The gate in the fence was locked, but again, my bolt cutters made short work of the chain. The boiler itself was a massive cast-iron monster from the 1960s that should have been replaced decades ago, but somehow kept limping along with regular maintenance and prayer. More importantly, the boiler room contained the access hatch to the city's utility tunnel system. It was a 3-foot square opening in the floor that was normally covered by a steel plate held down with bolts. The opening led directly into the main water supply tunnel that served this part of downtown Detroit. I had been through that hatch many times during the winter repair project, and I knew exactly where the tunnel led and how to navigate it safely. The bolts holding the access plate were rusted but not stripped, which meant I could remove them with the socket wrench from my tool bag. As I worked on the bolts, I could hear sounds coming from above me. Footsteps, voices, and occasional crashes that suggested the situation upstairs was getting worse. Whatever was happening in the lobby, It was not going well for the survivors who had gathered there. The access plate came free with a grinding screech that sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. I winced and froze, listening for any indication that the noise had attracted attention. After a few minutes of silence, I felt confident enough to continue. The opening revealed a ladder that descended about 10 feet into the main tunnel. My flashlight beam showed a concrete-lined passage that was tall enough to walk in and wide enough for maintenance equipment. The tunnel floor was dry, which was a relief given the flooding I had heard upstairs. Before I climbed down into the tunnel, I took one last look around the boiler room. This might be the last time I ever saw this building that had been my home for 8 years. It was not much to look at, just a basement full of old equipment and exposed pipes, but it represented stability and routine in a world that had suddenly become chaotic and dangerous. I was leaving behind everything familiar and heading into the unknown with nothing but my tools and my knowledge of the city's infrastructure. I lowered myself through the access opening and pulled the steel plate back into position above me. If anyone came looking for how I had escaped, they would have to work for it. The plate was heavy enough that it would take tools and effort to move, which might discourage casual investigation. More importantly, it would prevent anything from following me into the tunnel system. The main water supply tunnel was exactly as I remembered it from the winter project. The concrete walls were stained with decades of moisture and mineral deposits, but the construction was solid. The tunnel ran in a straight line toward downtown Detroit, with smaller branches connecting to individual buildings along the way. According to the city plans I had studied during the repair work, this tunnel connected to at least 6 other major utility corridors that served the entire downtown area. My destination was the water treatment plant where Jake and the other survivors were holed up. That facility was approximately 2 miles from my building, but the tunnel route was not direct. I would have to navigate through multiple connecting passages and avoid several areas where steam pipes created dangerous heat levels. The good news was that I had memorized most of the route during the months I had spent working on the water system upgrades. I started walking toward downtown, using my flashlight to navigate around obstacles and check for hazards. The tunnel floor was uneven in places, with maintenance hatches and pipe supports that could easily trip someone who was not paying attention. The air was stale and humid, but breathable. I could hear water moving through pipes above and around me, which meant the city's water system was still functioning despite whatever chaos was happening on the surface. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached the first major junction where my tunnel connected to a larger passage that served the steam distribution system. This was where things got more complicated. The steam tunnels were hotter and more dangerous, but they also provided the most direct route to the treatment plant. I would have to balance speed against safety and make sure I did not get caught in an area where equipment failure could kill me faster than any zombie. The junction was marked with faded signs that indicated directions to various parts of the city's infrastructure. Most of the signs were older than I was, installed back when Detroit's population was twice what it is now, and the city could afford to maintain its underground systems properly. But the basic layout had not changed much over the decades, and I was confident in my ability to navigate to where I needed to go. I chose the steam tunnel route because it would save me at least an hour of walking time. The passage was wider than the water tunnel, with overhead pipes that carried superheated steam to buildings throughout downtown. The temperature was noticeably higher, and I could feel sweat starting to form under my coveralls. But the tunnel was well lit by the heat glow from the pipes, which meant I could save my flashlight battery for areas where I really needed it. The steam tunnel had more branching passages than the water system, which made navigation more challenging. I had to stop several times to check the directional signs and make sure I was still heading toward the treatment plant. Some of the signs were completely illegible, worn away by decades of heat and moisture. Others pointed to parts of the city that no longer existed, casualties of urban decay and population loss. I was about halfway to my destination when I heard the first sounds that were not coming from mechanical systems. It was a scraping, dragging noise that echoed through the tunnels from somewhere behind me. Something was following me in the passage I had just traveled. I stopped walking and turned off my flashlight, listening carefully to determine what I was dealing with. The scraping continued, accompanied by wet footsteps that did not sound human. Whatever was in the tunnel with me was moving slowly but persistently in my direction. I had two choices: continue toward the treatment plant and hope I could stay ahead of whatever was following me, or find a place to hide and wait for it to pass. I decided to keep moving. The steam tunnel had several side passages that connected to other parts of the system, and I knew there was a maintenance chamber about half a mile ahead where I could potentially hide if necessary. More importantly, stopping would only give my pursuer time to catch up with me. In the tunnels, momentum was survival. The scraping sounds were getting closer, which meant whatever was following me was moving faster than I had initially thought. I picked up my pace, but I had to be careful not to make too much noise. The tunnels carried sound for long distances, and I did not want to attract attention from anything else that might be lurking in the system. I reached the maintenance chamber and ducked inside to catch my breath and reassess the situation. The chamber was a small room carved out of the tunnel wall, filled with valve controls and pressure gauges for the steam distribution system. It was not a permanent hiding place, but it gave me a chance to think through my options without being exposed in the main passage. The scraping sounds passed by the chamber entrance and continued down the tunnel in the direction I had been traveling. Whatever was following me had not detected my presence and was continuing toward downtown. That was both good and bad news. Good because it meant I was not in immediate danger. Bad because it meant there was something dangerous between me and my destination. I waited in the chamber for about 10 minutes before continuing my journey. The delay put me behind schedule, but it was better to be late than dead. I also took the opportunity to check my tool bag and make sure everything was secure. The last thing I needed was to drop something important in the dark tunnels and have to search for it while being pursued by whatever creatures had found their way into the underground system. The rest of the journey to the treatment plant was uneventful, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tunnels seemed to echo with sounds that might have been footsteps or might have been the settling of old infrastructure. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something dangerous, and every mechanical noise made me jump. By the time I reached the access point near the treatment plant, my nerves were completely frayed. The treatment plant's connection to the tunnel system was through a maintenance shaft that led directly into the facility's basement. The shaft was equipped with a ladder and emergency lighting, but I could see that the lights were not working. That probably meant the plant was running on backup power, which was not a good sign for the overall situation. I climbed the ladder and found myself in a utility room filled with pipes and electrical panels. The room was familiar from my work on the expansion project, but something felt wrong about it. The air was too still, and there was a smell that reminded me of the metallic scent I had encountered in my apartment building. I drew my pipe wrench and moved carefully toward the door that led to the main basement level. The basement of the treatment plant was a maze of corridors and equipment rooms that served the facility's water processing systems. During normal operations, the area would be busy with technicians and maintenance workers. But now it was empty and dark, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. I could hear the sound of machinery running, which meant the plant was still operational, but there were no human voices or footsteps. I made my way through the basement toward the stairs that led to the main floor where the administrative offices were located. That was where Jake and the others would most likely be holed up, since it offered the best visibility and multiple escape routes. But as I climbed the stairs, I could smell that metallic scent getting stronger. Something was very wrong in the upper levels of the plant. The main floor was a disaster area. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and dark stains on the walls told the story of a struggle that had not gone well for the human participants. I could see drag marks on the floor leading toward the rear of the building, and there were spent shell casings scattered around what looked like a defensive position near the main entrance. I called out Jake's name in a loud whisper, hoping to locate the survivors without attracting unwanted attention. There was no response. I tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Either they were not here, or they were hiding so well that they could not hear me, or something had happened to them that I did not want to think about. I made my way through the administrative area toward the control room where the plant's operations were monitored. If Jake and the others were anywhere in the facility, that would be the logical place to make a stand. The control room had reinforced doors, multiple communication systems, and visual monitors that covered the entire plant. It was also defensible and had its own backup power supply. The control room door was barricaded from the inside with furniture and equipment. I could see light coming from under the door, and I thought I heard voices. I knocked on the door using the pattern we had used during construction work. 3 quick raps, pause, 2 raps, pause, 3 raps. It was a simple code, but it would identify me as someone who belonged at the facility. The voices stopped, and I could hear movement behind the barricade. After a few minutes, the furniture was moved aside and the door opened to reveal Jake Morrison holding a shotgun. Behind him, I could see 3 other people I recognized from the construction crew. Dave Martinez, our electrical specialist, Sarah Chen, the project engineer, and Tommy Kowalski, who was supposed to be dead according to Jake's earlier phone call. Except Tommy did not look right. His skin had that same grayish pallor I had seen on Mr. Kim, and his eyes were completely white. He was restrained with electrical cable, but he was struggling against his bonds and making those wet growling sounds I had become all too familiar with. Jake noticed me staring and shook his head grimly. "He turned about an hour after I called you," Jake said. "We thought he was dead, but then he started moving again. We couldn't bring ourselves to put him down permanently, so we tied him up and hoped he might get better." I looked at Tommy, who had been one of my closest friends in the local union, and realized that whatever had happened to him was irreversible. The thing wearing Tommy's face was not Tommy anymore. It was something else, something that wanted to eat the living people around it. "Jake, we need to talk." Jake pulled me into the control room and helped barricade the door behind me. The room was smaller than I remembered, made even more cramped by the presence of 4 living people, and one that was no longer quite alive. Tommy was tied to a chair in the corner, constantly struggling against the electrical cables that bound him. The sound he made was a continuous low moan that set my teeth on edge. "We've been monitoring the radio traffic," Sarah Chen said, gesturing toward a bank of communication equipment. "It's not just Detroit. Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, every major city in the Midwest is reporting the same thing. The government's calling it a viral outbreak, but they're not being specific about transmission methods or treatment options." Dave Martinez was hunched over a laptop computer, trying to access news websites and emergency management databases. "Internet's spotty, but from what I can gather, the military's setting up containment zones around major population centers. They're not letting anyone in or out until they figure out what's causing this." I walked over to the control room's windows and looked out at the treatment plant's main compound. The facility was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, which provided decent security against normal threats. But I could see shapes moving in the shadows beyond the fence, and they were not moving like living people. Whatever had happened to Tommy was happening to people throughout the city, and they were drawn to areas where they could detect human activity. "How many people were here when this started?" I asked Jake. "About 15, counting the day shift and security. Most of them tried to leave when the emergency broadcast started, but only a few made it out of the parking lot before those things showed up. The rest are either dead or wandering around like Tommy." Sarah pulled up a schematic of the treatment plant on one of the computer monitors. "We've been trying to figure out our options." The facility has enough backup power to run essential systems for maybe 72 hours, assuming nothing breaks down. We have food and water for about a week if we ration carefully, but we're not equipped for a long-term siege. I studied the schematic, noting the locations of critical systems and potential vulnerabilities. The plant was designed to process millions of gallons of water per day, which required massive pumps, filtration systems, and chemical treatment equipment. Most of that equipment was automated, but it still required human oversight to function properly. If the facility failed, it would cut off water service to a significant portion of Detroit. What about communication with the outside world? I asked. Have you been able to reach any other survivor groups or emergency services? We made contact with a National Guard unit about 2 hours ago, Dave said. They're setting up a command post at the airport, but they said it would be at least 24 hours before they could send anyone to check on us. They advised us to stay put and avoid contact with infected individuals. I looked at Tommy again, noting how his struggles against the cables had become more violent since I arrived. We need to make a decision about him. Keeping him here is dangerous and it's not doing him any good. Jake's face went pale. Rory, I can't just kill Tommy. He's been my friend for 20 years. What if there's a cure? What if he gets better? Look at him, Jake. Really look at him. That's not Tommy anymore. Tommy died when that thing bit him at the job site. What's left is just his body being controlled by whatever virus or parasite is causing this outbreak. Sarah walked over to Tommy's chair and studied his face carefully. As a project engineer, she was trained to analyze problems objectively and make decisions based on data rather than emotion. Rory's right. His pupils are completely dilated. He's not responding to his name or any other verbal stimuli, and his body temperature feels at least 10 degrees below normal. Whatever's controlling him now, it's not human consciousness. Dave closed his laptop and joined our discussion. The radio traffic has been talking about this. The infected don't retain any memories or personality traits from their previous lives. They're driven entirely by the need to feed on living human flesh. The only way to stop them permanently is to destroy the brain. I could see Jake struggling with the decision, but I also knew that we could not afford to wait much longer. Tommy's presence in the control room was a constant threat, and his moaning was loud enough to potentially attract other infected individuals to our location. More importantly, keeping him alive was a drain on our emotional resources that we could not afford. I'll do it, I said. It should be someone who didn't know him as well. No, Jake shook his head firmly. If it has to be done, I should be the one to do it. He was my responsibility as foreman. Sarah intervened before the discussion could continue. We need to focus on the bigger picture. Even if we deal with Tommy, we're still trapped in this facility with limited resources and no clear plan for getting out. The radio reports suggest that the situation is getting worse, not better. She was right, of course. We had managed to find temporary safety in the treatment plant's control room, but it was not a long-term solution. The facility was isolated from other potential survivor groups, and our supplies would not last indefinitely. Sooner or later, we would have to leave the relative security of the plant and venture back into a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human life. I walked back to the windows and studied the perimeter fence more carefully. There were definitely more shapes moving around outside than there had been when I first arrived. The infected were being drawn to the facility by something, possibly the sound of the running machinery or the lights that indicated human activity. If their numbers continued to increase, they might eventually overwhelm the fence and gain access to the compound. We need to consider the possibility that this facility is not defensible in the long term, I said. The fence might keep them out for now, but it wasn't designed to withstand a sustained assault by hundreds of infected individuals. Dave pulled up security camera feeds on another monitor, showing views of the entire compound. We can see at least 50 of them outside the main gate, and more are arriving every hour. At this rate, we'll be completely surrounded by morning. Jake finally made his decision about Tommy. He walked over to the tool cabinet and retrieved a large wrench, similar to the one I carried in my own tool bag. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said quietly, then brought the wrench down on Tommy's skull with enough force to end his suffering permanently. The sudden silence in the control room was almost as disturbing as Tommy's constant moaning had been. We all stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened and what it meant for our survival. We had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and we were all complicit in the decision to end the life of someone who had been our friend and coworker. "We need to dispose of the body," Sarah said practically. "Leaving it in here with us is unsanitary and psychologically damaging." I helped Jake carry Tommy's body to a utility closet where it would be out of sight but not contaminate our immediate living space. As we moved him, I noticed that his body was already starting to smell like the infected individuals I had encountered in my apartment building. Whatever was causing the outbreak, it began affecting the body's normal processes even before death occurred. While we were dealing with Tommy's remains, Dave discovered something important on the radio. "I'm picking up a transmission from a group calling themselves the Detroit Emergency Coalition. They claim to have established a safe zone at the Renaissance Center downtown, and they're asking any survivor groups to make contact." The Renaissance Center was Detroit's most recognizable landmark, a complex of office towers and hotels that dominated the city's skyline. It was also heavily fortified and had its own security systems, which would make it an ideal location for a survivor enclave. But it was also more than 5 miles from our current location, through territory that was now controlled by the infected. "What kind of numbers are they reporting?" I asked. "They claim to have over 200 survivors and access to food, medical supplies, and ammunition. They're also saying they have contact with military units and expect to be evacuated within 48 hours. That was encouraging news, but it also created a dilemma. Should we stay at the treatment plant and hope for military rescue, or should we attempt to reach the Renaissance Center and join a larger group of survivors? Both options carried significant risks, but they also offered different potential rewards. Sarah was studying the city map on her computer screen, plotting potential routes between our location and downtown Detroit. The most direct route would take us through some of the most densely populated areas of the city. That's where we're most likely to encounter large numbers of infected individuals. "What about using the utility tunnel system?" I suggested. "I use the tunnels to get here from my apartment building, and they connect to most of downtown Detroit. We could potentially travel the entire distance underground." Jake looked skeptical. "Those tunnels weren't designed for human transportation. They're hot, cramped, and dangerous even under normal circumstances. Trying to navigate them during a crisis situation seems like a recipe for disaster." "It's safer than trying to travel on the surface," I argued. "The infected are drawn to movement and sound, but they don't seem to be aware of the underground infrastructure. We could move through the tunnel system without attracting their attention." Dave was researching the tunnel network on his computer, accessing city engineering databases that were still functioning despite the chaos above ground. "According to these maps, there's a direct connection between the treatment plant and the Renaissance Center through the main steam distribution tunnel. It would be about a 3-hour walk for people who know what they're doing." I had worked in those steam tunnels during various projects over the years, and I knew they were navigable if you understood the layout and had the right equipment. The temperature would be uncomfortably high, and there would be hazards like pressurized pipes and electrical systems to avoid. But it was definitely safer than trying to cross 5 miles of infected territory on foot. "There's another factor to consider," Sarah said. "If we leave the treatment plant, we're abandoning a critical piece of infrastructure that serves thousands of people. If the automated systems fail without human oversight, it could create a public health crisis even worse than the current outbreak." She had a valid point. The treatment plant was designed to operate autonomously for short periods, but it required regular maintenance and monitoring to function properly. If we abandoned the facility and something went wrong with the equipment, it could contaminate the water supply for a significant portion of Detroit. That would put any surviving population at risk of disease and dehydration. How long can the plant operate without human intervention? I asked. Under normal circumstances, maybe a week, Sarah replied. But these aren't normal circumstances. The electrical grid is unstable, the chemical supply systems are probably failing, and there's no one available to respond to equipment alarms. I'd estimate we have maybe 72 hours before something critical breaks down. That gave us a deadline for our decision. We could stay at the treatment plant for up to 3 days, but after that, we would be forced to choose between abandoning the facility or risking our lives to keep it operational. Neither option was particularly appealing, but the choice was being made for us by circumstances beyond our control. Dave continued monitoring the radio traffic, hoping to gather more information about the overall situation. I'm hearing reports of military airstrikes on major infected concentrations in Chicago and Milwaukee. They're apparently using fuel-air explosives to clear large areas of the cities. That was both encouraging and terrifying news. Encouraging because it suggested the military was taking decisive action to deal with the outbreak. Terrifying because it implied that conventional weapons and tactics were not sufficient to handle the infected, and more extreme measures were being considered. Are they planning similar operations in Detroit? Jake asked. No specific information about Detroit yet, but they're advising all civilian survivors to evacuate urban areas and move to designated safe zones in rural locations. The problem is that most of the safe zones are more than 100 miles away, and there's no transportation available. I was studying the treatment plant's layout again, focusing on the areas that would be most vulnerable to attack by large numbers of infected individuals. The main gate was the obvious weak point, but there were also service entrances and utility access points that could be exploited by anything smart enough to look for alternative entry routes. We need to make our defenses more robust, I said. Even if we decide to stay here temporarily, we should prepare for the possibility of a sustained assault. Sarah nodded in agreement. The plant's emergency protocols include procedures for lockdown situations, but they were designed for industrial accidents, not zombie attacks. We'll need to adapt them to our current circumstances. I spent the next hour walking through the facility with Jake, identifying potential security improvements and defensive positions. The treatment plant was a complex maze of buildings, pipes, and equipment that offered both advantages and disadvantages for defenders. The numerous hiding places and escape routes could work in our favor, but they could also provide concealment for attackers who managed to breach the perimeter. The facility's most valuable defensive asset was its steam distribution system. The network of high-pressure pipes carried superheated steam throughout the complex, and with proper manipulation, it could be weaponized to create barriers or clear areas of infected individuals. But using the steam system as a weapon would require precise knowledge of the valve controls and pressure ratings, and a single mistake could result in catastrophic equipment failure. I've been thinking about the tunnels, Jake said as we completed our security assessment. If we do decide to leave this place, we'll need to take essential supplies with us. The tunnels weren't designed for carrying equipment and will be limited in what we can bring. That was another important consideration. Our survival would depend on having the right tools and supplies, but the underground route would severely limit our carrying capacity. We would have to choose between mobility and resources, and there would be no opportunity to return for anything we left behind. Dave called us back to the control room with urgent news from the radio. I'm picking up distress calls from the Renaissance Center. They're reporting that their perimeter has been breached and they're under attack by a large group of infected. They're requesting immediate military assistance. The news hit us like a physical blow. The Renaissance Center had been our best hope for joining a larger survivor group, and if it was being overrun, Our options were becoming dangerously limited. We would have to reconsider our entire strategy and possibly accept that we were on our own for the foreseeable future. Are there any other survivor groups reporting in? Sarah asked. A few scattered groups in the suburb, but nothing with the size and resources of the Renaissance Center operation. Most of the reports are from small family groups or individuals who are just trying to stay alive from day to day. I realized that our situation at the treatment plant might actually be better than we had initially thought. We had defensible positions, access to clean water, and knowledge of the facility's systems that would allow us to maintain operations for an extended period. The isolation that had seemed like a disadvantage might actually be protecting us from the chaos that was consuming the rest of the city. Maybe we should consider staying here longer than we planned, I suggested. This facility has resources and defensive advantages that might not be available anywhere else. Jake was not convinced. But we're still only 4 people trying to defend a complex that was designed for a staff of 50. If we get overwhelmed, there won't be anyone coming to help us. Sarah was studying the plant's emergency procedures manual, looking for anything that might help our situation. There are protocols for operating the facility with a skeleton crew during emergencies. It's not ideal, but it's possible to maintain basic operations with just a few people if they know what they're doing. Dave suddenly looked up from his radio equipment with an expression of alarm. We've got a problem. I'm picking up sounds on the perimeter security system. Something's testing the fence at multiple locations. We all rushed to the security monitors to see what was happening outside. The infrared cameras showed dozens of infected individuals pressed against the chain-link fence, pushing and pulling at the wire mesh with coordinated effort. They were not acting like mindless zombies anymore. They were displaying pack behavior, working together to find weaknesses in our defenses. That's new, Sarah said grimly. The early reports described them as individual predators, not cooperative hunters. I watched the screens with growing concern as more infected arrived to join the assault on the fence. They were learning, adapting their behavior based on the obstacles they encountered. That suggested a level of intelligence that made them far more dangerous than we had assumed. We need to prepare for the possibility that they'll breach the perimeter, I said, and we need to do it now. The fence held for another 2 hours, but I could see it was starting to buckle under the constant pressure from the growing crowd of infected. What had started as maybe 50 individuals had swollen to hundreds, and they were arriving in larger groups with each passing hour. The chain link was designed to keep out vandals and unauthorized personnel, not to withstand a sustained assault by hundreds of bodies pressing against it simultaneously. We need to implement emergency protocols now, I told the group. Sarah, can you initiate the facility lockdown sequence? Dave, I need you to monitor all communication channels for any change in the military situation. Jake, help me prepare the steam distribution system for defensive use. Sarah moved to the main control panel and began entering the lockdown commands. Emergency, lockdown activated. All external access points are now sealed, backup power systems are online, and internal security doors are armed. We're as secure as we can make this place with the current infrastructure. Dave was cycling through radio frequencies, picking up fragments of military communications and emergency broadcasts. The situation is deteriorating rapidly across the entire region. I'm hearing reports of complete communication breakdowns in Chicago and Milwaukee. Detroit appears to be one of the last major cities with any organized response. I was studying the steam system controls, remembering the technical specifications from my work on the expansion project. The plant's steam distribution network was capable of delivering superheated vapor at pressures exceeding 300 pounds per square inch. That was enough pressure to strip flesh from bone and create barriers that no living creature could cross. But using the system as a weapon would require precise timing and thorough knowledge of the valve locations throughout the facility. Jake, I need you to help me map out the external steam outlets, I said. If we can create a barrier of superheated steam around the critical areas of the plant, we might be able to keep them away from the main buildings. Jake pulled up the engineering drawings on his computer screen. There are steam outlets every 50 feet along the perimeter walkways, plus emergency vents that can be manually activated from the control room. But Rory, if we use the steam system this way, we'll be depleting the plant's energy reserves much faster than normal. How much faster? Sarah asked, looking up from the control panel. Under normal operations, we could maintain steam pressure for maybe a week on backup power. If we're using it for defensive purposes, maybe 36 hours before the system starts shutting down non-essential functions. That gave us a deadline that was much shorter than I had hoped, but it was better than being overrun in the next few hours. I began calculating the steam pressure requirements for creating effective barriers around the most vulnerable areas of the facility. The main gate was the obvious priority, but we would also need to protect the service entrances and utility access points. Dave suddenly stood up from his radio equipment with an expression of alarm. I'm picking up a military broadcast on the emergency frequency. They're implementing something called Operation Scorched Earth in Detroit. All military personnel and essential civilian authorities are being evacuated to positions outside the city limits. What does that mean for us? Sarah asked. It means they're planning to abandon Detroit to the infected and establish a containment perimeter around the entire metropolitan area. Anyone left inside the city limits will be considered lost. The implications of that news hit us like a physical blow. We were not just dealing with a temporary crisis that would be resolved by military intervention. We were being written off as acceptable losses in a larger strategic operation. Whatever happened to us in the next few days, we would have to handle it ourselves without any hope of outside assistance. I looked at the security monitors again and saw that the infected had found a weak point in the fence near the main gate. They were working together to peel back sections of chain link, creating an opening that would allow them access to the compound. We had maybe 30 minutes before they breached the perimeter completely. Sarah, I need you to prepare the steam system for emergency activation. Jake, help me get to the basement level where the manual valve controls are located. Dave, keep monitoring the radio and let us know if anything changes with the military situation. The plant's basement level contained the manual override controls for every major system in the facility. During normal operations, everything was controlled from the main computer systems upstairs. But the emergency protocols included provisions for operating critical equipment by hand if the automated systems failed. I had helped install some of those manual controls during the expansion project, and I knew exactly where to find the valves that controlled steam distribution to the external outlets. The basement was darker and more cramped than the upper levels, filled with pipes and electrical conduits that created a maze of potential obstacles. Jake followed me through the narrow walkways between equipment, carrying a toolbox that contained the wrenches and socket sets we would need to operate the manual valve controls. The air down there was hot and humid, heated by the massive boilers that generated steam for the entire facility. Rory, are you sure this is going to work? Jake asked as we located the first set of valve controls. Using steam as a weapon seems like something that could backfire on us pretty easily. It's our best option for creating a defensive barrier without depleting our ammunition or exposing ourselves to direct contact with the infected, I replied. The steam outlets are positioned to cover all the critical approach routes to the main buildings. If we can maintain pressure for even a few hours, it might give us time to figure out our next move. I began opening the valves that would redirect steam from the internal heating system to the external defensive outlets. Each valve required precise adjustment to ensure proper pressure distribution without overloading any single section of the network. Too much pressure in one area could cause pipe failures that would be impossible to repair under our current circumstances. Jake was working on the valve controls for the secondary distribution network, which served the utility areas and service entrances. I'm getting resistance on valve number 7. It feels like it hasn't been operated in years. Use penetrating oil and give it time to work, I advised. Those valves were installed during the original construction in the 1970s, and they haven't been maintained as well as they should have been. But they're built to last, and they'll function if we're patient with them. While we worked on the valve controls, I could hear sounds from the upper levels that suggested the infected had breached the perimeter fence. There were scraping and pounding noises that seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if they were testing every possible entry point simultaneously. The facility's lockdown protocols would keep them out of the main buildings temporarily, but those barriers were not designed to withstand the kind of sustained assault we were facing. Jake, I need you to go back upstairs and coordinate with Sarah on the steam system activation. I'm going to stay down here and make sure all the manual controls are properly set before we begin the defensive sequence. Jake headed back toward the stairs, but he stopped and turned around before leaving the basement. Rory, I want you to know that whatever happens next, I'm glad you made it here. Having someone with your knowledge of these systems might be the only thing that saves us. After Jake left, I continued working on the valve controls, fine-tuning the pressure settings and checking for any signs of leakage or mechanical failure. The steam system was the backbone of the plant's operations, and any problems with the distribution network could cascade into complete facility shutdown. I could not afford to make mistakes with equipment that was critical to our survival. I was adjusting the final valve when I heard Dave's voice over the facility's public address system. Rory, we need you back in the control room immediately. The situation outside has changed dramatically. I made my way back through the basement maze and climbed the stairs to the main level. The sounds of the infected trying to break into the building were much louder now, and I could see through the windows that they had completely surrounded the main structure. There were hundreds of them pressed against the walls and doors, all making that wet moaning sound that had become the soundtrack of the apocalypse. In the control room, Sarah was monitoring the steam system pressure gauges while Dave continued his radio watch. Jake was studying the security camera feeds, tracking the movement of infected individuals around the facility perimeter. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "What's the situation?" I asked. "They've breached the fence at 3 different locations," Sarah reported. "But they're not spreading out randomly like we expected. They're concentrating their efforts on the main administration building where we're located. It's like they know exactly where we are." Dave looked up from his radio equipment. "I've been monitoring their vocalizations on the security system. They're not just making random noise. There's a pattern to the sounds they're making, like they're communicating with each other." That was deeply disturbing news. If the infected were capable of coordinated communication, it suggested a level of intelligence that made them far more dangerous than we had assumed. They were not mindless predators driven by instinct. They were organized hunters working together to achieve a specific goal. "Are the steam system controls ready for activation?" I asked Sarah. "All manual valves are set according to your specifications. Pressure is building in the distribution network, and we're ready to activate the external outlets on your command." I studied the security monitors, looking for the optimal moment to begin the steam defensive sequence. The infected were concentrated around the building's main entrance and service doors, but they had not yet discovered the utility access points that could provide alternate routes into the facility. If I timed the steam release correctly, I could create barriers that would force them away from the critical areas without using up all our pressure reserves. "Sarah, activate steam outlets 1 through 6 at 50% pressure. That should create a barrier around the main entrance without depleting our reserves too quickly." Sarah entered the activation commands, and within minutes, we could see the results on the security monitors. Clouds of superheated steam erupted from outlets around the building's perimeter, creating a wall of vapor that was hot enough to cause severe burns to any living tissue. The infected individuals near the outlets were driven back by the heat, some of them collapsing as the steam scalded their bodies. "It's working," Jake said with relief. "They're backing away from the main building." But my celebration was short-lived. As I watched the monitors, I could see that the infected were not randomly retreating. They were moving in an organized fashion toward areas of the facility that were not protected by steam barriers. They were learning from the defensive measures we had deployed and adapting their tactics accordingly. "They're regrouping near the water treatment building," Dave observed. "That structure doesn't have steam outlets because it houses sensitive filtration equipment." The water treatment building was the heart of the entire facility, containing the pumps and filtration systems that processed millions of gallons of water per day. If the infected gained access to that building, they could contaminate the water supply for a significant portion of Detroit. Even worse, the building was connected to the administration structure through underground utility tunnels that could provide them with a route to our location. "We need to extend the steam barriers to cover the treatment building," I said. "Sarah, can you redirect pressure from the internal heating system to create coverage for that area?" "I can try, but it will mean shutting down heating to most of the facility. If we're planning to stay here for an extended period, that could become a problem. Right now, staying alive is more important than staying comfortable. Do it." Sarah began the process of redirecting steam pressure to cover the treatment building, but it would take several minutes for the system to respond to the new settings. During that time, the infected would have an opportunity to breach the building and gain access to critical equipment. I watched the security monitors with growing anxiety as dozens of them converged on the treatment facility. Dave was monitoring radio communications from other survivor groups scattered throughout the Detroit area. "I'm picking up reports of similar coordinated behavior from infected groups in other parts of the city. They're not acting like individual predators anymore. They're displaying pack hunting behavior and tactical awareness." That confirmed my worst fears about the evolution of the outbreak. Whatever was controlling the infected individuals was learning and adapting at a pace that outstripped our ability to develop countermeasures. We were dealing with an enemy that became more dangerous with each encounter. "Jake, I need you to help me prepare backup defensive positions inside the facility," I said. "If they breach the outer perimeter, we need to be ready to fall back to more secure areas." Jake and I began identifying the most defensible positions within the administration building. The control room was obviously our primary stronghold, but it was not designed to withstand a siege. We needed alternate positions with better sight lines, multiple escape routes, and access to essential resources like food and water. The facility's emergency shelter was located in the basement level, designed to protect essential personnel during industrial accidents or natural disasters. It had reinforced walls, independent air filtration, and emergency supplies that could sustain a small group for several days. But it also had limited visibility and only one exit, which made it a potential trap if the infected discovered our location. "What about the water tank access platforms?" Jake suggested. "They're elevated positions with good visibility and multiple ways to reach them. Plus, they're connected to the steam distribution system if we need to use it for defensive purposes." The water storage tanks were massive concrete structures that rose several stories above the main facility. The access platforms and catwalks that surrounded them would provide excellent defensive positions with commanding views of the entire compound. But they would also leave us exposed to attack from multiple directions if the infected found ways to reach the elevated areas. Sarah called out from the control room. "Steam pressure is now covering the treatment building, but I'm getting alarms from the filtration systems. The sudden pressure changes are affecting the automated controls." I rushed back to the control room to assess the situation. The computer displays showed multiple system warnings related to water pressure fluctuations and filtration efficiency. The steam defensive system was working to keep the infected away from critical equipment, but it was also disrupting the normal operations that kept the facility functional. Can you stabilize the filtration systems without compromising the steam barriers? I asked. I can try, but it's going to require constant manual adjustments to balance the pressure demands of both systems. We're pushing this equipment beyond its design parameters. Dave looked up from his radio with grim news. Military communications are reporting that the infection has spread beyond the major urban areas. They're detecting infected individuals in rural communities and small towns throughout the Midwest. The containment strategy is failing. That news eliminated any hope we might have had for eventual rescue or evacuation. We were truly on our own, with no prospect of outside assistance and no safe havens to retreat to. Our survival would depend entirely on our ability to maintain control of the treatment facility and its resources. I was studying the facility schematics again, looking for ways to improve our defensive capabilities, when alarms began sounding throughout the plant. Sarah was frantically working at the control panel, trying to identify the source of the emergency. "We've got a major system failure in the primary filtration building," she announced. "The automated controls are offline, and water pressure is dropping throughout the distribution network. Without the filtration systems, the treatment plant could not process raw water from the Detroit River into the clean water that supplied thousands of homes and businesses. If the failure was not corrected quickly, it would create a public health crisis that would persist long after the current outbreak was resolved. I have to go to the filtration building and restart the systems manually," Sarah said. "It's the only way to restore normal operations." "Absolutely not," Jake replied. "That building is surrounded by infected individuals. It would be suicide to leave the administration building now." Sarah pulled up the plant's emergency procedures on her computer screen. According to the protocols, loss of filtration capability requires immediate manual intervention to prevent catastrophic system failure. If we don't act within the next hour, the entire plant will shut down automatically. I realized that we were facing an impossible choice. We could stay in the relative safety of the administration building and watch the treatment plant fail, eliminating any reason for us to remain at the facility. Or we could risk our lives to restore the filtration systems and maintain our defensive position, but with no guarantee that we would survive the attempt. "There might be another option," I said, remembering something from my work on the expansion project. "The filtration building is connected to the administration structure through the utility tunnel system. If we can reach the manual controls through the underground route, we might be able to restart the systems without exposing ourselves to the infected." Sarah studied the facility blueprints on her computer. The tunnel connection exists, but it's a narrow maintenance crawlway that was never designed for regular human access. It would be extremely dangerous even under normal circumstances. More dangerous than trying to cross a compound full of infected individuals. She considered the question for a moment, then shook her head. "You're right. The tunnel route is our best option, but someone with detailed knowledge of the filtration systems would have to make the trip. I'm the only one here qualified to restart those systems manually." Jake was adamantly opposed to the plan. "Sarah, you're not expendable. If something happens to you in those tunnels, we lose our only systems engineer. The risk is too high. If we don't restart the filtration systems, we'll lose the entire facility anyway," Sarah countered. "At least this way we have a chance of maintaining our position." I was torn between agreeing with Jake's concerns about safety and recognizing that Sarah was right about our strategic situation. The treatment plant was only valuable as a defensive position if it remained operational. Without the filtration systems, we would be defending a useless piece of infrastructure while our water supplies dwindled. "I'll go with her," I decided. "I know the tunnel system better than anyone else here, and I can help her navigate the route safely." Dave looked up from his radio equipment. "Before anyone goes anywhere, you need to hear this. I'm picking up a transmission from a military aircraft requesting coordinates for an airstrike on this facility." The military transmission that Dave intercepted changed everything in an instant. We were no longer just fighting for control of the water treatment facility. We were fighting against time itself, with the very real possibility that our own government would destroy us along with the infected masses surrounding our position. "How long do we have?" I asked Dave, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. The transmission mentioned a target time of 0600 hours. That gives us maybe 4 hours before they level this entire facility. Sarah was already moving toward the tunnel access point. "Then we need to restart those filtration systems immediately. If the plant is going to be destroyed anyway, at least we can ensure the water supply is restored for any survivors in the city." I grabbed my tool bag and followed her toward the basement access. "Jake, you and Dave need to prepare for immediate evacuation. If we can get the filtration systems running, we'll need to leave this facility and find another defensive position before the airstrike." "Where exactly are we supposed to go?" Jake asked. "The entire city is overrun with infected, and the military is bombing anything that looks like a concentration point." That was a question I did not have a good answer for, but I knew we had to keep moving. Staying at the treatment plant was no longer an option, regardless of whether we could restore the filtration systems. Our survival depended on finding a new location that would provide shelter and resources without attracting military attention. The tunnel access point was located in the basement near the boiler room, behind a panel that was marked for authorized personnel only. I had used this route several times during the expansion project, but always under controlled conditions with proper safety equipment and communication support. Crawling through the tunnel system during an emergency, with infected individuals potentially waiting at the other end, was far more dangerous than anything I had attempted before. "Sarah, before we go into those tunnels, I need you to understand exactly what we're dealing with," I said. "The crawlway is barely 3 feet high and maybe 2 feet wide. It's going to be hot, cramped, and dark. If something goes wrong, there won't be room to turn around or help each other." "I understand the risks," she replied, "but I also understand that without the filtration systems, this entire region will be without clean water for months. That's thousands of people who will die from dehydration and disease even if they survive the infection." I removed the access panel and shined my flashlight into the tunnel opening. The crawlway extended into darkness, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that would make movement difficult. The air coming out of the tunnel was hot and humid, heated by the steam distribution system that ran parallel to the water lines. "Stay close behind me and don't touch any of the pipes," I instructed. "Some of them carry superheated steam that will cause severe burns. If you hear any unusual sounds or feel anything dripping on you, stop immediately and let me know." I entered the tunnel first, crawling on my hands and knees through the narrow space. My tool bag scraped against the tunnel walls, and I had to be careful not to snag the straps on any of the protruding pipe fittings. The temperature was noticeably higher than the basement level, and I could feel sweat starting to form under my coveralls. Sarah followed behind me, moving carefully to avoid the hazards I had warned her about. The tunnel was longer than I remembered, probably because crawling through it was much slower than walking through the main utility corridors. Every few feet, we had to navigate around junction boxes or valve assemblies that reduced the available space even further. "How much farther?" Sarah asked after we had been crawling for about 10 minutes. "Maybe halfway," I replied. "The tunnel makes a 90-degree turn up ahead, and then it's a straight shot to the filtration building." As we approached the turn, I could hear sounds coming from somewhere ahead of us. Not the mechanical noises of pumps and motors, but something that sounded organic. Wet, sliding sounds that reminded me of the infected individuals we had been fighting to keep out of the facility. I stopped crawling and motioned for Sarah to remain quiet. The sounds were definitely coming from the direction of the filtration building, which meant that the infected had found a way into that structure despite our steam barriers. We would be crawling directly into a building that was potentially full of hostile creatures. "Sarah, we have a problem," I whispered. There's something in the filtration building that shouldn't be there. Can we continue with the mission anyway? She asked. The filtration controls are in a separate room that might not be compromised. I considered our options carefully. We could turn back and abandon the attempt to restart the filtration systems, which would mean accepting the eventual destruction of the treatment plant. Or we could continue through the tunnel and hope that we could reach the control room without encountering whatever had gotten into the building. We'll continue, but we need to be prepared for anything, I decided. Do you have any kind of weapon? Just a utility knife from my tool kit. That was not much, but it was better than nothing. I had my pipe wrench, which was heavy enough to cause serious damage to anything that threatened us. More importantly, I had detailed knowledge of the filtration building's layout, which would allow us to move quickly to the control room and avoid areas where infected individuals might be congregating. We continued through the tunnel, moving as quietly as possible to avoid attracting attention from whatever was in the building ahead of us. The sounds were getting louder and more distinct, confirming that there were multiple infected individuals in the filtration facility. They seemed to be concentrated in the main processing area, which was some distance from the control room where we needed to go. The tunnel ended at another access panel, similar to the one we had entered through. I could see light coming through the gaps around the panel, which suggested that the emergency lighting in the filtration building was still functioning. That was good news for visibility, but it also meant that any infected individuals in the area would be able to see us clearly. I listened carefully at the panel for several minutes, trying to determine if there was anything immediately on the other side. The sounds of movement were coming from deeper in the building, but I could not be certain that the immediate area was clear. Opening the panel would commit us to entering the building, regardless of what we found on the other side. Sarah, once I open this panel, we'll need to move quickly to the control room, I whispered. Do you remember the layout from the facility blueprints? The control room is approximately 50 feet from this access point, through a corridor, and past the main equipment bay. If we can avoid the processing area where those sounds are coming from, we should be able to reach it without being detected. I slowly removed the access panel, trying not to make any noise that would attract attention. The opening led into a utility closet that was filled with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. The closet door was closed, which provided some concealment from anything that might be in the main corridor. I crawled out of the tunnel and helped Sarah exit behind me. The air in the filtration building was thick with humidity and chemical odors from the water treatment processes. I could hear the sounds of infected individuals more clearly now, and they seemed to be moving around randomly rather than searching for specific targets. They don't know we're here, I whispered to Sarah. If we move carefully, we might be able to reach the control room without alerting them to our presence. I opened the closet door just far enough to see into the main corridor. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lighting, and I could see wet footprints on the floor that had not been there during normal operations. The footprints led toward the processing area where the sounds were coming from, but they also showed that infected individuals had been moving throughout the building. We slipped out of the closet and began moving down the corridor toward the control room. The distance seemed much longer than 50 feet when we were trying to move silently past rooms that might contain hostile creatures. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise on the wet floor, and we had to resist the urge to move quickly despite the time pressure we were facing. The control room door was equipped with an electronic lock that required Sarah's access card to open. She swiped the card and entered her security code, and the lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet corridor. We quickly slipped inside and closed the door behind us, hoping that we had not been detected. The filtration control room was a smaller version of the main plant control center, filled with computer monitors and control panels that managed the water processing systems. Sarah immediately began assessing the system status, checking displays and running diagnostics to determine what had caused the shutdown. The primary pumps are offline due to pressure fluctuations from our steam defensive system, she reported. I can restart them manually, but it will take about 15 minutes to bring the entire filtration process back online. Do it, I said. I'll watch the door and make sure we're not interrupted. Sarah began the restart sequence, working through a complex series of procedures that would restore normal water processing operations. Each step had to be completed in the correct order, and any mistakes could result in equipment damage that would be impossible to repair under our current circumstances. While Sarah worked on the filtration systems, I monitored the corridor through the control room's small window. The infected individuals in the building seemed to be concentrated in the main processing area, but occasionally one would wander into view in the hallway. They moved with that characteristic shuffling gait, but they also displayed a level of purposefulness that suggested they were searching for something specific. Rory, I need you to manually open valve assembly number 4, Sarah said. It's located in the equipment bay next to this room, and I can't activate it remotely. That meant leaving the relative safety of the control room and venturing into an area where infected individuals might be present. But without that valve opening, the filtration restart would fail, and our entire mission would be wasted effort. Where exactly is the valve assembly? I asked. It's a large red wheel valve about halfway down the equipment bay. You'll need to turn it counterclockwise until it stops, then return here immediately. I took my pipe wrench and opened the control room door carefully. The equipment bay was a large open area filled with pumps, tanks, and filtration equipment. The lighting was better than in the corridor, but that also meant greater visibility for anything that might be lurking among the machinery. I could see the valve assembly that Sarah had described, mounted on a large pipe that ran along the far wall of the equipment bay. Reaching it would require crossing about 30 feet of open space and working next to equipment that was starting to vibrate and hum as the restart sequence progressed. I moved quickly but carefully across the equipment bay, using the larger pieces of machinery as cover in case any infected individuals appeared. The valve was exactly where Sarah had indicated, and it turned easily despite years of mineral buildup. As I completed the adjustment, I heard sounds coming from the main processing area that suggested the infected were becoming agitated by the noise of the restarting equipment. I made it back to the control room just as the first infected individual appeared in the equipment bay. It was a woman in a laboratory coat who had probably been working in the facility when the outbreak began. Her skin had the characteristic grayish pallor, and her movements were jerky and unnatural. But what caught my attention was that she seemed to be looking directly at the control room, as if she knew exactly where we were hiding. "Sarah, how much longer do you need?" I asked urgently. "Maybe 5 more minutes to complete the startup sequence. The systems are responding normally, but I have to wait for pressure to stabilize throughout the distribution network." The infected woman in the laboratory coat was joined by 2 others, and they were all moving toward the control room with obvious intent. They had detected our presence somehow, possibly through sound or scent, and they were no longer wandering aimlessly through the facility. "We've been compromised," I told Sarah. "They know we're in here." "I can't stop the restart sequence now," she replied. "If I interrupt it at this point, we'll have to begin the entire process over again." I positioned myself at the control room door with my pipe wrench, preparing to defend our position if the infected managed to break through. The door was not particularly robust, designed to keep out unauthorized personnel rather than determined attackers. If they applied concentrated pressure, they would eventually force their way into the room. The infected individuals reached the control room door and began testing it for weaknesses. They pushed against it, scratched at the frame, and made those wet moaning sounds that had become so familiar. But they also displayed problem-solving behavior that was deeply disturbing. They were working together to find ways to compromise the door's integrity. "Sarah, we're going to have company very soon," I warned. "Is there another way out of this room? There's an emergency exit that leads to the external walkway, but it's alarmed and will alert anyone monitoring the security systems. At this point, I don't think stealth is our primary concern. Sarah continued working on the filtration restart while I watched the infected individuals testing our defenses. They had found the door's hinges and were attempting to remove the pins that held the door in place. It was a level of technical thinking that contradicted everything we thought we knew about their mental capabilities. The filtration systems came back online with a vibration that shook the entire building. Water began flowing through the processing equipment, and the various pumps and motors resumed their normal operational cycles. We had succeeded in restoring the plant's primary function, but we were now trapped in a control room that was about to be breached by hostile creatures. "Sarah, activate the emergency exit and get ready to run," I instructed. "Once that door opens, we'll have maybe seconds to reach safety." She moved to the emergency exit and entered the unlock code. The exit led to an external walkway that connected to the main administration building, but it would expose us to any infected individuals that might be outside the filtration facility. We would be trading one set of dangers for another, but at least we would have mobility and multiple escape routes. The control room door began to give way under the sustained assault from the infected individuals. The frame was starting to splinter, and I could see fingers reaching through the gaps as they worked to widen the opening. In another minute or two, they would have enough space to force their way into the room. "Go now," I told Sarah, and she pushed open the emergency exit. The external walkway was clear of infected individuals, but I could see dozens of them in the compound below us. The steam barriers we had created earlier were still functioning, but they had been depleted by the system modifications needed to restart the filtration equipment. Large areas of the facility were no longer protected by the defensive measures we had put in place. We ran along the walkway toward the administration building, but before we could reach safety, I heard the distinctive sound of military aircraft approaching from the north. The airstrike that Dave had intercepted was beginning, and we were still in the target zone with no adequate shelter. "The water storage tanks," I shouted to Sarah. "They're reinforced concrete that might provide protection from the bombing." We changed direction and headed for the massive water storage tanks that dominated the facility's skyline. The access ladders to the tank platforms were located on the far side of the structures, which meant crossing more exposed walkways while military aircraft circled overhead. The first explosions occurred as we reached the base of the storage tanks. The impacts were somewhere in the main processing area, and I could feel the shock waves through the concrete platform beneath our feet. The military was using precision munitions to target specific buildings, but the destruction was spreading beyond the intended impact zones. We climbed the access ladder to the first platform level, which was about 30 feet above the main facility. From that elevation, we could see the entire compound and the surrounding areas of Detroit. The city was burning in multiple locations, with smoke columns rising from what had once been densely populated neighborhoods. Sarah was monitoring the filtration systems from a portable diagnostic unit that she had brought from the control room. "The restart was successful," she reported. "Water processing is back to normal levels, and the distribution pressure is stabilizing throughout the network." That was encouraging news, but it was overshadowed by the fact that we were stranded on a water tank platform, while military aircraft systematically destroyed the facility around us. We had accomplished our mission to restore the water supply, but we were now faced with the immediate problem of surviving the next few hours. Dave and Jake are still in the administration building, I realized. We need to signal them to evacuate before that structure is targeted. I used my flashlight to send a series of signals toward the administration building, hoping that they would see the light and understand that they needed to leave immediately. The military bombing was proceeding methodically from the outer buildings toward the center of the facility, which meant the administration structure would be targeted soon. After several minutes of signaling, I saw movement in the control room windows. Dave and Jake had received our message and were preparing to evacuate their position. They appeared on the external walkway carrying emergency supplies and equipment, moving toward the same water storage tank where we had taken shelter. The administration building exploded just as they reached the base of the storage tank. The blast was much larger than the previous impacts, suggesting that the military had used a more powerful munition to ensure complete destruction. Debris rained down around the water tank, and the shock wave nearly knocked us off the platform. Jake and Dave climbed the access ladder and joined us on the platform, both of them shaken by their close escape from the building they had called home for the past day. We were now all together again, but we were stranded in a facility that was being systematically destroyed around us. The radio equipment was destroyed in the blast, Dave reported. We have no communication capability and no way to monitor military or emergency frequencies. What about our evacuation options? Jake asked. We can't stay on this platform indefinitely. I studied the surrounding area, looking for routes that would allow us to leave the facility without exposing ourselves to continued bombing or large concentrations of infected individuals. The utility tunnel system was still intact as far as I could tell, but many of the access points had been damaged or blocked by debris from the airstrikes. There's a tunnel connection about 200 yards north of here that leads to the municipal water main, I said. If we can reach that access point, we can travel underground to other parts of the city. Sarah was still monitoring the filtration systems, ensuring that our work had not been undone by the bombing. The water processing equipment is still functioning normally despite the explosions. The distribution network should be able to supply clean water to the surviving population for months without additional maintenance. That was the best news we had received in hours. We had successfully completed our mission to restore the water supply, and the facility would continue to serve the city's needs even after our departure. Whatever happened to us next, we had made a meaningful contribution to the survival of other people who were struggling with the same crisis. The military aircraft completed their bombing run and departed toward the north, leaving behind a facility that was largely destroyed but still partially functional. We waited on the platform for another hour to ensure that the airstrike was complete, then began planning our evacuation from the water treatment plant. Where are we going to go? Jake asked. The entire city is compromised, and we don't have any reliable information about safe zones or other survivor groups. I thought about my sister Colleen in Chicago, and the promise I had made to myself to reach her no matter what obstacles stood in my way. The utility tunnel system extended beyond Detroit, connecting to regional water supplies and other infrastructure networks that served multiple cities. If I could navigate those tunnels successfully, I might be able to travel hundreds of miles underground without being detected by infected individuals or military forces. I'm going to Chicago, I announced. My sister is there, and I have the knowledge and tools to make the journey through the underground infrastructure. Anyone who wants to come with me is welcome, but I understand if you want to try a different approach. Sarah was the first to respond. I'll come with you. My engineering knowledge might be useful for navigating complex underground systems, and I don't have any better options for long-term survival. Dave nodded in agreement. I can contribute communication and electronics expertise. If we encounter other survivor groups along the way, having radio capability could be valuable. Jake was more hesitant. Rory, I appreciate everything you've done to keep us alive, but traveling through underground tunnels for hundreds of miles sounds incredibly dangerous. Are you sure there's not a safer alternative? Jake, look around you, I replied, gesturing toward the burning city that surrounded us. There are no safe alternatives anymore. The surface world belongs to the infected and the military forces that are trying to contain them. Underground is the only place where we have a chance of traveling undetected. As we prepared to descend from the water tank platform and begin our journey into the tunnel system, I reflected on everything that had happened since that first emergency broadcast interrupted Monday Night Football. In less than 48 hours, My entire world had been transformed from routine predictability to constant danger and uncertainty. But I had also discovered that my knowledge of pipes and tunnels and city infrastructure, skills that most people considered mundane and unglamorous, had become the keys to survival in a world gone mad. The same utility systems that I had spent 15 years installing and maintaining were now the pathways that would carry us toward whatever future awaited us in a country overrun by the walking dead. We climbed down from the water tank and began moving toward the tunnel access point that would start our journey to Chicago. Behind us, the Detroit Water Treatment Facility continued to process clean water for the city's survivors, a testament to the critical importance of infrastructure in maintaining civilization even during its darkest hours. That's how I survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak. Through knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to make hard choices when survival was on the line. But that was just the beginning of a much longer journey that would test everything I thought I knew about courage, loyalty, and what it means to be human when the world itself has become inhuman. If you're hearing this story, it means you're still alive and still fighting. Remember that every skill you possess, no matter how ordinary it might seem, could be the thing that saves your life or the lives of people around you. Learn your environment, understand the systems that keep your community functioning, and never underestimate the value of practical knowledge in a crisis. Stay alive, stay human, and never give up hope that somewhere out there, other people are fighting the same fight and working toward the same goal of rebuilding what we've lost.